Daniel, the 6th chapter. And as we got to chapter 4 and 5, I've started to draw more attention to this parallelism that is part of the structure of the way Daniel was written and put together. And we have chapter 4 paralleling chapter 5. And those two chapters had to do with humbling themselves, the kings, or ourselves as we apply it to us, before God. Nebuchadnezzar was arrogant and was humbled. Belshazzar was arrogant and was humbled in a very different way. Nebuchadnezzar lost his mind, became like an animal, and came to his senses, recognizing God as the true power, and had everything restored to him. Belshazzar, his life was taken. In fact, at the end of chapter 5, we saw the end of the Babylonian Empire. It has come to an end and is no more. So if those two chapters parallel, what chapter does chapter 6 parallel? Four and 5 parallel. 6 is paralleled with the chapter just before 5, or 4:4. 3, right? What happens in chapter 3? Do you recall? You can cheat if you want. Cheating may be Google or pages in your Bible, either one. Yeah, the fiery furnace. Absolutely. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery furnace. So what's the parallel? Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. It's a pretty close mirror image, isn't it? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace because they would not bow to the image that seemed to represent the role of the empire, or Nebuchadnezzar's role, one of the two. What is Daniel thrown into the lion's den for? Yeah, pretty much the same thing. For making petition or prayer to God versus prayer to the king. So we have those parallels. Now, as we think about structure, I'll draw your attention to one last point that I think is very helpful as we consider the book of Daniel. At the end of chapter 6, of which I'm not certain we will finish today, we end the historical aspect of Daniel. In chapter 7, we'll go back into the Hebrew language as it's written, although I think it'd be preferable if we read it in English versus Hebrew. But chapter 7, we have this shift that we'll get into as we address that. So to this point, Daniel's purpose in writing this has been to show the people that while they are oppressed, while their nation has been conquered by an evil, ungodly nation, God is still in control, is able to humble even the kings and show deliverance to those who are his. Questions or comments on that? Very applicable points, right? Now, you don't have to have the answer. You can answer on impression when I ask this question. How old was Daniel when he was thrown into the lion's den? Just your impression. How old do you think Daniel was when he was thrown into the lion's den? 30? Anyone else? We'll let Dad represent the lot. He was brave. That would have been my impression. In fact, in all the pictures you look at, Daniel's somewhat a young man. 30's young. To me, a few years ago, that seemed really old, but now it seems really young. 30 years old. Daniel was somewhere between early 60s to mid 80s when he was thrown into the lion's den. Raise your hand if you have pictured him throughout the years as being that old when he was thrown into the lion's den. I didn't. Yeah, that's how I would picture it. To me, it adds a little bit of richness to this, that Daniel's still at it, and it adds a little bit to the picture of maybe the feebleness of Daniel. Now, I'm not sure. There's two unknown factors that dictate the age. Exactly how old was Daniel when he was taken into captivity? Estimates seem to range between 15 and 19. That's only 4 years range. The bigger range is whether you take when Judah fell, which was 536 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar completely wipes out Jerusalem and brings all the captives, or it's when his kingdom started, which was 605 BC. So there's quite a time difference there between the two. There's some evidence pointing each way. It's really hard to tell. What we do know is early in Nebuchadnezzar's reign that he went and he took a number of captives out of Babylon, out of Jerusalem, and brought them to Babylon. If that was the case with Daniel, he's likely 80 to 85 years old at this point. If he was taken in captivity at the time of that Jerusalem was taken into or destroyed, then he's in his early 60s. In any case, he's not a young pup, right? He's got some age to him. Questions or comments on that? Pause and say good morning to Darian. It's good to have you with us this morning. Well, with that then, let's go ahead and start into chapter 6. We'll read the first 5 verses, and there is one more historical point or difficulty that we need to address here that I introduced last week, and then we'll get into the rest of this chapter. Would someone read verses 1 through 5 of Daniel 6, please?
20 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because he excelled spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaints against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God."
Thank you, Bob. So, we see the new structure. As I mentioned before, at the end of chapter 5, the Babylonian Empire is done. Babylon is captured and it's under new rule. Now, a question that we need to deal with or address right off the bat, just for purposes you may or may not have heard this before now, or you may hear at some point in the future, is who's Darius? And Darius is a very difficult person to nail down historically, because we do not have any evidence of Darius or that name. Actually, there is one reference historically that refers to him connecting the name to Garuba, a governor of Babylon. And that's personally who I think he is. We'll address that in just a moment. The other option seems to be that Darius and Cyrus is one in the same person. I don't personally believe that, because in verse 31 we see Darius is a Mede. So Babylon is captured and taken over by an alliance of the Medes and the Persians, right? The Medo-Persian Empire is what starts. Now, in very short period of time, the Persians, they always are, but really become the dominant force. And so the empire, more and more as it goes on, looks like a Persian empire, but it starts out as a Medo-Persian empire. Cyrus, we know, through history, is the king in charge of the Babylonian conquering Babylon. What we see at the end of chapter 5 is, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So to me, it is not congruent to see Cyrus and Darius as the same person, because Cyrus is a Persian, Darius is a Mede. Furthermore, if you look at the end of chapter 6, the last verse in chapter 6 says, "So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." It seems to me very strong evidence that these two individuals are different individuals. So then, if Darius is not Cyrus, if he is this governor, then there's this other difficulty that comes up. And that is that Daniel speaks of him as the king. Well, if this is a governor of Babylon in the surrounding area, why would Daniel speak of him as a king? I think for two reasons that are easily explained. Number one, in the Arabic language, there was not differentiation between king, governor, emperor. There wasn't this big, vast description or many different words to describe it. Secondly, from Daniel's perspective, Darius is king. Who are you reporting to? Darius. Who's in charge of everything surrounding your life? Darius, right? And so to me, that goes together very easily. Questions or comments? I'm not sure how clear I was in explaining that. So in short, I believe Cyrus is the king, the Persian king, and he gives Darius, although it seems in most historical contexts that he went by another name, that he gave Darius control over Babylon. And for Daniel, that's his world. That's what he's writing about. He's writing this from the Jewish perspective. Questions or comments? So if you'll recall, and I haven't got our poster back up, but I'm going to refer to it as though it's here, and maybe you'll picture it in your head. The Babylonian Empire was what metal? Gold, right. And then right under that, the Medo-Persian Empire was what metal? You remember? Little less valuable. Silver. Yeah, silver. And silver was the metal of currency of the day. That represented money. And what Persians were really good at was hoarding money. And we see that alluded to right here in Daniel with the structure. So Darius is setting up over his reign 120 satraps. That's not a word we use, but this is a government official. And what's their primary purpose? The end of verse 2. Yes, absolutely. And one phrase further, if you would, Kevin. Yeah, so the king would have no damage or loss. Kevin says liability. So what they're really, really good at is collecting taxes, right? And we're going to put all these people over smaller areas so that we can ensure that nothing falls through the cracks, right? We're going to account for that. Now, over those 120 satraps, we need some middle management, though, right? They didn't know the 80s was coming. It was time to cut out all middle management. But middle management here is not very big. So what's middle management here in the Babylonian region? It's now the Persian, Medo-Persian Empire. But what's middle management? Who is just above these 120 satraps? 3 presidents, right? Presidents isn't a word that either of our translations use. High officials is what the ESV uses. But I think it's easy for us to put a term to it, 3 presidents. And what's happening in the opening clause here what's happening in the opening clause of this chapter is that Daniel is on the brink of being set up as the leader of the 3 presidents, right? The head of the 3 presidents. He's elevated, about to be elevated to that point. Now, why is he going to be elevated? And the answer to that is found in verse 3. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. An excellent spirit, or a spirit of excellency, was in him. Now, there's all kind of discussion we could get into. Is this supernatural? Is this a gift of the Spirit? Is this just Daniel being very skilled? In my mind, the answer to all those is yes, right? It's a mixed bag. Here's why I think the most applicable lesson for us from this is Daniel is serving in a pagan kingdom. And how's he doing it? With excellence, right? He's doing it incredibly well. He's not saying, this kingdom, is not of God. This kingdom, has 4,000 gods. Actually, that was the Babylonian Empire, but the Persians were pagan too. There is some differences we'll mention in their religion in just a moment. But he's not saying, I can't do anything here. What's he doing? He's doing his job, and he's doing it incredibly well. To the point that he's going to be put to the head of these 3 presidents that are over the entire kingdom. Questions or comments on that point?
Dreams brought him to the forefront.
Yeah, that's where we see him rising to occasion. Although his abilities, I think, do go beyond that. Certainly in chapter 1, we saw that he and his 3 friends excelled 10 times above the other wise men. And so, absolutely, that is what brought him, that's what brought him to the forefront. Who are the 3? I'm not certain, Darian, that's a great question. I'm not sure that the other 2 are named. We have Daniel named among these 3 that's going to be elevated to the top, but the other 2 are not named. And they are simply of the Medes or Persians, and that's about as much of a description as we see of them. So it's a great question, though. Great question. Now, if someone wanted to find fault with you, where would they find it? There's probably lots of things coming, if we're right. Depending how honest we are with ourselves. I mean, right now I've got a list of 18, but we don't have time for all those. But think about this for a moment. these other officials are very upset with Daniel. Jealousy is the best, jealousy and envy, right? Mixed together is the best idea we see. He probably stands out as well. Not probably, he stands out. He's not like them in so many regards. So they don't like him. So they are going to strive to find a problem with Daniel. And here's their conclusion. And I think this is just incredible statement about Daniel. We shall not find, this is verse 5, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Wow. He's doing his job with so much integrity. He's doing his job with so much excellence. He is interacting in his relationships with so much integrity and excellence that they say, if we're going to get anything on Daniel, we're going to have to put the law of the land against the law of his God. It's the only thing we can do to get against him. Wow. Wow. Now, also, I think we have a contrast here, or a very important part. Did Daniel work very, very hard and well for a pagan government? Absolutely. That's inherent, main thread of the message here. Did he do it, or was he willing to do it at the cost of his spiritual relationship with his God? No. No. Those are the lines that Daniel from chapter 1 clear through are drawing out very, very well. Easy concept to see, a lot more difficult to apply and be consistent in, right? Very difficult message there. Just so you know, Darian, you're absolutely no interruption whatsoever. If you have a question or comment, please share it. We love to see those, and that way I know where everyone else is too. So please feel free to share. All right, any other questions before we move on to this next passage? Would someone read verses 6, this is a longer reading, through 15, please. 6 through 15.
Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was...
Kevin, I'm going to stop you there, even though that's not what I originally said.
Okay.
Thank you. There's plenty there, and I'd missed a marker. These high officials, these princes, presidents and princes gathered together, and they go to Darius. They've got a plan now, right? A conspiracy against Daniel. And they go to Darius and they say, well, what do you say when you're before a king? Every time. O king, live forever, right? O Darius, that's the response we see all through Scripture. So if I'm ever before a king, I know what to say. But there's also a strong level of flattery here, isn't there? And they are appealing to his ego. And this is a theme that we've seen throughout Daniel. We don't have to go back to Daniel to see it, do we? Arrogance and ego, large ego and leadership. All these leaders believe that they are in power because they're better than everyone else. In fact, we're going to see these ones believe they are deity. It's something we still deal with to this very day, right? And so they know how to get Daniel. These are smart people. They're people. And people can be pretty smart when they want. So they know, they've observed, they've learned something about Daniel, and they know a lot about Darius. And so they make this petition to Darius. And they say, make this decree that no one for 30 days can pray to any other god except for you, O king. And they bring to the forefront this idea, this Mede and Persian law that says it cannot be revoked. So they are, upon first glance, when I read through this a few times, I thought, well, here's evidence that Darius is just the governor, not the high king, right? But I don't think that's really what we're getting at here. And this was always puzzling to me. If Darius is king, can't the king do what he wants? And yet there's this law that says he cannot revoke a decree. Okay, well, revoke that law. You're king. Do what you want. Implied here is something that the people of their time would have known. And it's somewhat easy for us to miss. And that is the fact that these kings were claiming to be deity. And it's something that throughout many of these empires, we see it in the Egyptian empires, right? We certainly see it here in the Mede-Persian Empire. We see it in the Roman Empire, particularly later in the empire, that they claim to be gods. We're really getting at this whole idea of the image of man elevating itself versus being the image of God that we were created to be, right? And so that's why there was this law that the decree couldn't be revoked, because a king, or a god, does not revoke what he says. Now, there's historical precedents that some scholars believe that these officials were relying on, where just prior to this, there was in the Persian kingdom a case where a king, in his rash anger, sentenced a man to death and immediately regretted it. And I don't know if she's with us online yet. She's resting this morning, and then she's planning on being here for worship. But she said two things the other day. She says, I'm never riding a horse again, and I'm never working for Uncle Chris. And then in the hospital, she was angry with me, and she said, Dad, why? Because she was mad with Uncle Chris for making her get back on a horse after she'd come off. And so she says, and Chris says, Anna, I only did that because your dad told me I had to. So now she's mad at me. And she says, Dad, why would you make him do that? I said, because you said you're never getting on a horse again. That's not how we end. Dad, why would you believe me when I say that? I say things like that all the time when I'm upset. And so she was already revoking both the statements, right? And so this king in the Persian kingdom says, you're going to die. And then immediately regretted it, but still had to go through with it. It's believed that these are what the officials had in mind when they were doing this. that is an interesting concept that I hadn't really thought of, that if I understand Darian right, that he says they're claiming to be a god, and yet they're not above the rule of the land, right? So that is really interesting. So even though they claim some level of deity, they're not above the law. And I think that somewhat I'm addressing there is the cause for that, because the concept was a god would not revoke what he said. That was part of their culture. So great observation there. Now, there's another observation here that's important to us to understand all this. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego disobeyed Nebuchadnezzar, what was their form of punishment? Fire. Yeah, they were thrown into the fiery furnace, and that's something that we know, looking at historical references, that the Babylonians did all the time. Now we're under a new empire, new leadership, and what's going to be Daniel's punishment? Fed to lions. It's interesting to me that the Persians worshipped the fire gods, and it was almost an abomination to kill people that way, something they looked down upon. So what they did is they would tend to feed people to wild beasts. Now, being fed to lions would be bad enough, but it's worth noting that usually what took place with these animals is that they were starved. They were not fed well. So that when they threw people in front of a lion, it was ravenous. It was quick, yeah. And, sometimes you see people, I'll leave out all the descriptions, but they jump into the lions' cages at the zoos, right? Or sometimes fall. We'll be a little more graceful this morning, and of our judgments, and they fall into a lion's pen at a zoo. Now, it always ends poorly, no doubt. But do you ever notice in any of those videos that the lion normally plays with them and, messes with them, bites them and drags them around? Well, those lions are well fed. They're still lions, but they're well fed. It's not what these lions are going to do. I think there's an important distinction there. These lions are hungry. We see that. Yes, absolutely. So it's great observation. So these lions are incredibly hungry. When this injunction is signed, it's done. The satraps, the princes and presidents, they've got a victory, right? It's all said and done. Questions or comments on that? Let's end with 10 through 15. Would someone read that for us?
Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king, and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed.
Thank you, Kevin. So, when Daniel knew the document had been signed, this is really interesting to me. Daniel is not grandstanding. How do we know that? He's doing simply what he was doing aforetime or previously. This is how they knew to get him. How to get him. Now, could have Daniel closed the blinds? Seems likely. Now, we're putting a little bit of our culture and background into that. It would seem from their culture that Daniel would have had almost a tower as part of his house with lattice windows around it. That was high, would be a place for meditation, or in Daniel's case, prayer. So, the idea is these blinds that we could just close is putting something in there. Could Daniel hid and still prayed? Yes. Why didn't he? He's done it this way all the time. And I think he's very cognizant of the message that would send. Right? That you can impact how I pray to my God. Now, they pray towards Jerusalem. That was the seat of God, the temple, right? The ark sat there, of course, not this particular time, but that was the dwelling place of God. And so they are praying towards Jerusalem, and this is something that they did constantly. Now, the satraps, they throw all the cards on the table. They're all in at this point. All the chips are pushed, right? Because they go to the king and say, remember, king. I guess first I'm missing the point where they hide outside Daniel's house. If they'd had phones, they would have been taking pictures, right? They have lots of witnesses so that they can go back to the king and say, Daniel doesn't care about you, king. It's interesting that Darius is immediately regretful. It tells us what he thinks of Daniel. He in no way had Daniel in mind when he signed this petition. And so he's sorrowful. He's sorrowful. So again, these satraps, they think they've won, but all the chips are pushed at this point. And what they've not taken into account is God. That's what they have not considered whatsoever. Questions or comments as we close today? Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the deliverance and the message of delivering Daniel from these lions and the what happens to these other leaders. Thank you for your time.